state competitive RFGA training and technical assistance session. As a reminder, we will post this on the Serve Washington website along with our continuation training that we will be doing immediately after this. We will also have this available via email if you want to reach out and have the slides and the recording emailed to you. Thank you for joining us today. A few housekeeping items. This call is intended for new and recompete applicants. So knowing that there are a few AmeriCorps recompete applicants on this call, some of this information may be of a reminder for you, or you've heard it all before, but we want to keep in mind that we do have some new guests joining us who may possibly be interested in AmeriCorps funding. Unfortunately, AmeriCorps has not updated this visual since last year. So these are our demographic numbers as of last year in terms of how much funding we've received, how many Siegel Education Awards were given out. So those numbers have actually increased in terms of our awards that have been made, but that is a quick snapshot and the most recent that AmeriCorps had available. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with AmeriCorps funding, the mission is to improve lives, strengthen communities, and foster civic engagement through through service and volunteering. As the federal agency for national service, it brings people together to tackle the country's toughest challenges, aiming to make service a cornerstone of American culture. So competitive funding, normally we would say it's an annual competition that occurs in the fall. However, everything for the last 12 months or so in the federal landscape has been quite different and delayed. Those of you who have gone through that with us over the last year are familiar with the impacts it's had to the general federal timeline as well as here at the commission. But typically this NOFO that we received from AmeriCorps just last week would have been released during the summer months, and then Serve Washington as a commission would have released the RFGA along with the NOFO and hosted this session in the fall. Applications would typically be due in mid to late fall, and then the commission would submit all applications to the federal agency, usually in the January timeframe. So you can see in comparison how delayed things are, but we're hoping to, moving forward, beginning this spring, moving into next fall, things will start to go back to what was once considered a normal expectation in terms of timelines. Some things to note with competitive funding, this is typically for larger programs. AmeriCorps is specifically asking for 20 or more members this year, and to meet their national priorities, which we will cover, and then to focus on a single focus area or well-established multi-effort, and then be able to provide moderate to strong evidence for the need. Historic focus areas really haven't changed a whole lot, although there has been a removal of some DEI focused areas, and that was a result of the executive orders that were passed down starting to occur a year ago in January. So we have had to update much of our language as our subgrantees have in order to maintain that funding. So we have done our best to remove those words from our materials and our guidance. And if you follow the federal NOFO that was released for FY26, you will notice some very large changes in that space in terms of wording and focus areas. So if you are a recompete, please pay special attention to those words and to those focus areas to make sure you're in alignment for the best chance of funding. This is a list of the AmeriCorps funding. There's obviously much more explanation and examples in terms of this list, but I would say the focus, if you can keep it in one of these areas, that's what's most important. Again, if you're wanting more explanation, for example, what does it mean to create a workforce pathway for AmeriCorps members? What is that focus on strengthening families? I would encourage you to read those descriptions in that federal NOFO. I want want to highlight that many of these have not changed over the years, and that there's an added emphasis on benefit for AmeriCorps members with that enhancement for member experience and expanding services to formerly incarcerated and at-risk youth. Priority funding areas in Washington also tend to somewhat mimic the federal funding priorities in terms of we have also had to remove much of our focus areas that, led into those DEI pathways because we are trying to establish more confidence in federal funding in this current landscape. So, um, our funding priorities will be more present with the formula opportunity that will happen early this spring, and I'll speak more about that shortly. And I wanted to highlight that, we are not making any decisions here at the commission for new and recompete competitive funding. Those award decisions are made at the federal level, and we act as your state commission with grant compliance, adherence, training and technical assistance, and making sure your grant application is packaged as one and submitted to the federal agency by that due date. A reminder that AmeriCorps makes 3-year grant awards and generally makes an initial award, but you must submit a new budget and a new continuation application every year after your first year of award. And the award amounts may be different depending on the scope of your project. And just a reminder that you may be awarded less than your full ask in the application. A few notes about AmeriCorps members. Members must engage in direct service. So a minimum of 70% of their time over the course of their service year must be serving those in the community as defined by your grant application. There is a maximum 20% training threshold. However, I want to point out, effective this fiscal year, we are able to start providing and approving training waivers for programs in our portfolio, which would allow for that threshold to be increased from 20% all the way up to 50% if your program meets those certain circumstances, for example, an apprenticeship program. We currently have one program in our portfolio that has successfully applied for that waiver, and they will be able to have 50% of their member hours for this program year dedicated towards training. It's really important to point out that AmeriCorps members may not duplicate or displace any agency or organizational employees in the organization or service site in which they're serving. So, for example, if this was a school-based service site and that school was needing more paraeducators, they should not displace those paraeducator positions by bringing on AmeriCorps members and allowing them to serve in replacement of those positions. AmeriCorps members are never considered employees of an agency or organization. They're always considered participants, and therefore they don't they're not privy to many of the benefits of being an agency or organization employee and should not be considered employees. And and terms such as pay or work or paycheck should be avoided at all costs because they are not considered pay. It's considered a living stipend that they are receiving every month. And then at the completion of their service, they earn that Siegel Education Award. And with that, I will pause for a bit and I will have Thomas Darnell, our grants officer, talk about budgets.
Thanks, Diane. Before I start, I just want to note that I think a few people joined after you said to sign in with the Q&A, which is an unusual, counterintuitive thing. So if you haven't signed into the Q&A, please do. Yeah, so there's two types of grants in terms of budgets. There's cost reimbursement and fixed amount. Um, the cost reimbursement is the more basic grant where if you're a new program who's never had an AmeriCorps grant before, we'd expect you to be applying for cost reimbursement. Um, so you submit a full budget for the program. It'll be by category, and then under each category, there'll be line items. Um, what you'll have is a divide between federal and grantee share. The grantee share is your match. If you're a new program, your match requirement will be 24% of the budget. So 76% of the budget would be taken by the federal funds, and 24% would be provided by your organization in the budget as grants, as match, grantee share. So when you fill out that budget narrative, you're going to have a box that says calculation. That's going to be your description of what you're buying, why, but like what it costs, where you got the number from that you're putting in the number box. So you want to make sure that your calculations are accurate because there isn't a check for that. There will be a check that all the numbers that you put in your budget add up, but when it comes to the calculation for how you arrived at that number, there isn't a check for that. And if you miss some things, you can be way off. So yeah, there's a lot of basic things like if someone's your employee, your organization's employee, their pay goes under salary if they're going to be paid on the grant. The same for their fringe benefits. And when it comes to line items, don't be super vague. Like, when it says staff travel, don't be like travel for staff, $1,200. Say roughly what the travel is for, like travel for site visits, 30 site visits, average of 50 miles per site visit, mileage at this amount, do the calculation. That's the way you want to come up with those things. Yeah, thank you. So a thing to consider is the indirect rate. So the de minimis rate has been increased to 15% as of last year. You still have the AmeriCorps Corporation fixed rate, which is 5% of federal costs, and 10% of the full budget can be used as match. You can get more out of your indirect rate using the de minimis, but the de minimis is a little more complicated. It'll really only increase your match. But if you start using the de minimis on this, you'll have to use it for all your federal grants as an organization. There's some other limitations on the de minimis. It's a little bit complicated. There'll be things like, it's the modified total direct costs. So there are certain items that might be in your budget that you can't apply the de minimis 15% to. But if you're aware of all of those things, there's absolutely no problem with using the de minimis. And of course, if you have a federally approved indirect cost rate, you can use that. We'll look for documentation of that, but that'll be fine. And then when it comes to, as you're honing down your budget, you'll probably be shifting some stuff around. Just make sure that as you change things up in the upper two sections, make sure that you're recalculating section 3 if those direct cost totals change. Source of funds, don't forget that part. That's just where are your matching funds coming from? Could be unrestricted funds from your organization. It could be a couple grants you've secured. Yeah, wherever your funding for the program's coming from. And
Thomas, sorry, this is
yes,
Sean. We have a hand raised. I'm not sure if you could see that in the chat. Would it be okay to answer that? Whoop, the hand is up. Yes. Does the person, is that okay, timing?
You can
okay.
go ahead and ask your question. I see
Yeah.
the hand up.
You see it? Okay.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
I have two questions actually. For the de minimis rate, it's 15%, but I think in the NOFO it says that even if you use the de minimis rate, there's still a limit of 5% indirect cost that AmeriCorps will pay for. Is that correct?
That's correct. So on the federal side, there's a limit of 5% of total federal costs can be drawn as grant funds. But the full 15% could be used between the two. So basically, you take 15% of all eligible costs, then you take the 5% of the federal costs, subtract it from that 15%, and everything that's left can be used as match.
Okay, great. I think that helps with my second question, which was about the AmeriCorps fixed rate 5% and then the 10% match. It sounds like that's the
Mhm.
same type of calculation, that
Yeah,
5% is what you can apply to your federal costs, and then the remaining 10% of the total budget you can use as match.
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, and the last thing on this slide is just your fingerprinting and background check costs. Make sure that those go into your budget because it'll be a few $100 to over 1,000 depending on the size of your program. Now for a fixed amount, I think you probably are very familiar. I don't think anything's changed. Just remember to use the members without living allowance option, even though you're going to pay them a living allowance, and use the source of funds. I think that's everything I have on that.
Great, thanks, Thomas. Before we move on from the budgeting piece, are there any additional questions that we could answer now live? All right, not seeing any hands raised. We'll definitely be monitoring the Q&A. So if there's anything in there that we need to address, feel free to take yourself off mute. And I'm happy to take a moment to answer those questions. Moving on about eligible applicants, just a reminder in this year's NOFO, you must have a minimum of 20 members. So that designation has changed from MSY designation to members. So just pay special attention to that. And with the delay of the NOFO, there's also been a change in terms of when your project may start. So many recompetes may be used to August 1 or even a July 1 start date, and you would be unable to start your service year prior to September 1st. However, you may have noticed in the NOFO that you are eligible to request startup for your grant, the fiscal portion of your grant to start up at least 1 month earlier. So just keep that in mind. There are some definite changes for those of you who have hosted AmeriCorps programming in the past. If you haven't, an eligible entity would be a nonprofit, higher ed institution, any state or local government, and tribal governments as well. It's really important to pay attention to knowing that you have an active and valid UEI number, EIN number, and that your SAM registration is active and up to date. If you are unsure about your SAM registration, definitely check it today. We also have a link that we can provide if you want to send us an email, and I will share that email address again in this presentation. But I can't stress that enough, that if you are unsure if you have a SAM registration or you're unsure if it's up to date, I recommend checking that as soon as possible. And in terms of the RFGA process, it does actually look a little different for us this year as well. So we typically would bring on our commissioners to form a grant review committee, or even maybe outside community members. And with the timing of the NOFO being released this year and us having to kind of scramble and develop an RFGA and a process and a timeline within about 2 days, we came together as a staff and spoke with our commission about there really just isn't time to form a grant review committee, have them vote, and then us move forward with the votes and notifications. So we eliminated that from our RFGA process this year, but I want to highlight we do plan to bring that back for formula if the formula timeline allows. And that's just an overall general reminder that, again, at the commission, we do not make award decisions about competitive applicants. We help solicit and we help manage and package those applications up, but we are not the deciding factor when it comes to your awards. However, with our formula application process, we do decide at the commission level how awards are made and for how much. So that's the key difference there, and why we were able to move forward without a grant review committee for this competitive process this year. So you can see in the visual here, once you submit your application no later than February 25th, we will be in contact with you about clarification a couple of times if needed over the course of the month until we submit those applications to AmeriCorps. So definitely make yourself available for questions, corrections, updates, changes, and we will partner with you to make sure that you have the most solid application possible and there's no missing pieces to that before we submit everything to AmeriCorps towards the end of March. Here's the timeline that we had listed in our RFGA as well. So as you can see, your applications are due to serve Washington by February 25th, and we are going to rank those and turn those in by March 26th. So again, in comparison to other years, this is an extremely short timeline. So that was part of the reason for us eliminating the grant review committee. You should receive notification in mid-June. That is an estimate provided directly by AmeriCorps. There may be an additional clarification revision period by the federal agency, but they plan to issue those awards mid-August, which is why the pushback of that project start date to September. And I know in the AmeriCorps world, we throw around a lot of acronyms. So when you hear NOFO, that is the notice that was released by AmeriCorps last week. The RFGA was developed and released by obviously us or Washington for all competitive applications right now. And then later we'll be releasing a formula RFGA, which is also based off that same NOFO, which was just released by AmeriCorps last week. The difference between competitive versus formula, I already explained that quite a bit, and I put an asterisk next to fall because that didn't occur in the fall. But we do expect for formula, we expect to receive, per AmeriCorps, they said that we should expect to receive our formula instructions and allocations by the end of February. So we would expect to start that process in March. So I want to point out there may be some overlapping. I know last year we had a few programs that were not awarded competitively, but we were able to sync into our formula applications, which were also delayed. So that occurred last summer instead of last spring. And so it's just something we will all have to collectively monitor in terms of if, hoping this doesn't occur, but if your competitive application is not awarded, how we want to pay close attention to the timing of having you be considered for our formula funding, knowing that what we're able to award may look drastically different than what you're asking for in your competitive application. And we don't know yet what our formula allocation will be. However, we do know that through the package that was agreed upon on the federal level earlier this week, we do expect flat funding. So we're expecting similar funding for formula that we received last year, but nothing is guaranteed until we receive that formal allocation and those formal instructions. And the difference between new and recompete, because I know that you've heard me use those terms as well. New is you've never received AmeriCorps funding before. This is your first time. Recompete is you have received funding, but you are going to have completed that 3-year grant cycle by the end of this program year. And so you're now applying for a recompete for a new 3-year cycle. And then continuation, which is a separate call that we're having right after this, is when you're entering year 2 or 3 of your current cycle. And just some reminders, there are dates in the NOFO. Please do not follow those dates, as you will not be submitting your application directly to AmeriCorps, and you will be submitting through the commission as well. So always pay close attention to that timeline that's in our Serve Washington RFGA and that slide I just showed 2 slides ago. And also, if you are needing to send in those additional documents to AmeriCorps, please follow the RFGA and make sure to send those in to us here at the commission. And that email address, the servewa@ofm.wa.gov, that's the email address you'll want to use for anything. So even if you're a recompete and you're used to communicating directly with your program officer or directly with Lou or Thomas, we really need questions to go to that general inbox to make sure we're creating an environment of fair and equitable competition between all applicants. And some other highlights I want to point out are the page limits. So that would be 11 pages for your narrative, 8 for the logic model. There has not been a change to match since last fiscal year, so that remains the same. No change to the maximum cost per MSY. You can see the results of flat funding here. And then that full-time living allowance also has not changed in terms of minimum or maximum thresholds. There also has not been a change to this date for your criminal history check charge. So as Thomas mentioned, you'll want to be sure to budget that for all your members, all the slots. You know, even if you have 100 slots and you're not confident you'll be able to fill all 100 member slots, you still want to make sure you're budgeting for all members to receive those criminal history checks. Additionally, if you are a cost reimbursement program, and it's okay if you're a new applicant and you're not quite sure yet, but just want to put it out there that if you are a cost reimbursement program, you will want to be sure that every staff member who is going to be charging time to this federal grant has accurate and timely criminal history checks. So more to come on that once your application is complete and you're awarded. We will definitely be providing the guidance and information for that, but be sure to include that in your budgeting if you are planning to apply for a cost reimbursement versus a fixed grant. And I've highlighted the changes in the application weight that occurred this year versus last year. So you can see the 3 highlighted areas where the weight has changed. And so I would, if you're a recompete, I would pay special attention to that. And just in general, I think it's really important to note, you know, if you find yourself spending extra time in your narratives and then revert back to this and realize you're focusing on an area that may not carry as much weight as one area, it might be a way to center yourself in your grant writing. And a few other key highlights in terms of what remained the same. Obviously, the cost per MSY, which I just covered. The NOFO priorities changes with those added public safety and crime prevention, the strengthening families, and the expanding outdoor recreation for future generations. Again, for more descriptions around those, definitely refer to your NOFO. And then another reminder of the new threshold requirement of a minimum of 20 AmeriCorps members per application. So again, not the reference to the MSY, but the number of members. And then a few other, if you are a recompete, you'll want to pay very close attention to your slot types because that is moving from 7 to 5, and you will no longer have the capability for that reduced halftime or abbreviated time if you're a new and recompete. And there's a few other changes that we pointed out on here, which are also highlighted in the NOFO and RFGA. And I will now pass it to Lou, our management analyst, and they are going to cover evaluations and the logic model.
Thanks. Sorry, thanks, Diane. Yes, so the first narrative section is the community and logic model, where you will provide a detailed summary of the community problem that your program is addressing and an explanation of how your program's intervention will lead to the outcomes identified in the logic model. Next slide. So the NOFO doesn't offer a whole lot of detail about what to include in the narrative. It describes the logic model with a lot more specificity, but what we've historically found and recommend here is describing the scope of the problem, how significant it is, and the cause of the problem that your intervention will address. And we recommend using statistics and data from sources that are reputable, as current as you can find, and as local to the area that you're going to be serving. Can we go to the next slide, I believe? And a word of caution about really lengthy problem statements that outline just every possible negative condition in a service area if it's not directly related to the proposed intervention and outcome of your program. Next slide. So I want to highlight that the expectation that was in the previous years that you referenced, the social vulnerability index, that has been removed. I've searched all the documents for that wording and I'm not finding it anywhere. So I think that's safe to say that we do not need to mention the social vulnerability index. However, if you find it to be a helpful data source for your program, you can certainly use it, but just wanted to highlight that it's not required any longer for those of you who have been around for a while. Next is the logic model. And I think AmeriCorps does a pretty good job of explaining exactly what they're looking for. So I just want to highlight a few things, especially some areas that I've seen applicants struggle with. So as Diane mentioned, the logic model can be up to 8 pages now, which is more than a number of years ago. So you do have more room to describe things. Nevertheless, in that first problem column, it really can be a very short summary. I wouldn't expect you to use all 8 pages, just a couple sentences, a few sentences summarizing the problem that you described in the narrative part of the application. And next, you'll describe the inputs or resources necessary to deliver the intervention, including locations or sites. You don't have to list, like I know some of our programs are very large, you have dozens of service sites, so you don't have to list everyone by name or anything like that, but you could just describe the types of sites where members are going to be serving, the number of AmeriCorps members, any characteristics of AmeriCorps members that are relevant, including like specific knowledge or skills or abilities that they need in order to implement the intervention. And then in the intervention column, we are looking for quite a bit of detail there about the activities that members will be engaged in. So the length of each activity, such as the total number of weeks, sessions, or months, and then the number of hours per session or session per week, as well as the target population of the intervention. So AmeriCorps calls that the dosage. We really want to see for each intervention, what is your dosage? Next are the measurable outputs. And I feel like that one's pretty straightforward. However, if you are using a national performance measure, include the name of that output measure in the output column, such as ED1A, so that it matches up. And kind of same with the outcome columns. So the outcomes are those that result from the intervention, including meaningful changes in knowledge, skill, attitude, behavior, or condition. And if you are using a national performance measure, then put the name of the performance measure, like ED5, for example. And AmeriCorps does expect you to include short-term outcomes, which would happen during that 1 year of program activity. Medium, we usually think of those as the outcomes that take place during a full grant cycle. And then long-term outcomes might be even beyond that, like the ultimate goal of your program. And also remember that you are certainly not required to measure all of the components of your logic model. You will have a performance measure that is included in there and is consistent with your logic model. And whatever you choose as your performance measure should represent significant program activity. And if you have multiple interventions, those should all be included in the logic model with the above information for each intervention. So corresponding outputs, outcomes, etc. All right, let's talk a little bit about evidence. AmeriCorps is interested in the level of evidence in support of your chosen intervention, which increases the likelihood of cause and effect relationship. So in the narrative section, they're asking that you fully summarize any study designs and key findings of any outcome or impact evaluation that you submit. Describe any other evidence that supports the proposed program design. And I want to highlight this because I think a lot of times programs leave it out, and I think it's really valuable. So that could be even your own past performance data. That should definitely go in this section. If you've been meeting your measures and what you've been finding, what you've been learning, that would absolutely be something to include. If you submit evaluation reports for consideration, then those do need to be described in the section in the evidence section, and you would make sure that it's very clear how the intervention described in the report is the same as the intervention described in the application. And I think that's the case whether it's a evaluation report of a different program that's not your own, but the intervention is the same, or even if it is an evaluation report of your program. I think you still would want to emphasize that you are still using the same intervention, the same program design, and that it hasn't changed from the evaluation report that's being submitted. And then the last bullet on this slide, I really want to call attention to the NOFO, page 10. This language is new, so I want to make sure everyone has seen it. So it says applicants rated as insufficient evidence are removed from funding consideration. And then they describe what insufficient evidence means. So that's determined by an applicant being assessed as in the pre-preliminary evidence tier and providing inadequate responses to the evidence quality review standards below. So to be clear, you can still be rated as being in the pre-preliminary evidence tier as long as you're also responding to the evidence quality pieces adequately. But I wanted to point that out because that is new language. So let's look, we can go to the next slide. So this is the specific criteria for the pre-preliminary evidence tier that you would make sure that you are addressing these 3 bullet points. So you use relevant evidence, including past performance measure data and or cited research studies to inform your proposed program design. The described evidence is relatively recent, preferably from the last 6 years, and the evidence described by the applicant indicates a meaningful positive effect on program beneficiaries or AmeriCorps members in at least one key outcome of interest. So I know we do have some programs that fall in the preliminary evidence tier, which is totally fine. Just make sure that you are paying attention to this and meeting those criteria. All right. So to continue on a little more about the evidence, so there are 2 parts basically to the section, and you're scored on both of them. So one is the level of evidence, or the tier that you're assigned, which is defined in the mandatory supplemental instructions, including the preliminary, moderate, and strong. And the only tiers that allow for additional submission of hard copy evaluations beyond the narrative description are preliminary, moderate, and strong. So if you are in the preliminary, you would just describe evaluations, research data within the narrative. You won't be submitting additional documents related to that. And eligible applicants should only submit evaluation reports that reflect the exact same intervention and program design as your program, and only up to 2 reports. Although that can change a bit if you also are required to submit an evaluation report, then you might end up with 3 documents related to evidence. Okay, we can move to performance measures. I have just a few points here to share on the performance measures and the performance measure module. And I want to note, as Diane shared also with the scoring, that it is required that you have one aligned set of performance measures, but this part is not scored. So just want to make sure that people are aware of that. That is not scored. So your performance measure should correspond to the proposed primary intervention. And this can be a national performance measure, or it can be an applicant determined measure if none of the national performance measures accurately capture your intervention. Then you can create your own applicant determined measure. And if there are performance measures you see that reflect activities that your members are engaged in, but they're not really central to your program model, then don't include them in your application. They don't need to be reported to AmeriCorps. You can still collect data for your own purposes. So a common pitfall we see sometimes are really lengthy problem statements with long paragraphs. Just want to point out it can be a really brief summary, 2 or 3 sentence summary. And same with the described instrument on the next slide. That section, we can keep it as brief as possible, while also including enough information for a reviewer to assess. So be sure to include who's counted and explain the change required between pre and post to be counted, and indicate how this change is significant or meaningful. All right, now we can move on to evaluation. We are almost finished with my pieces. So this is, again, a bit different from previous years. The evaluation plan is going to be submitted via a summary form. So previously there was a template. Now it's a summary form, so it's a little bit different. And again, just to point out that evaluation plans, while they are a required component of your program, they're not scored as part of the grant making process. And this is a big change. AmeriCorps will no longer review and provide feedback on them. I personally would suggest still roughly following the sections of the plan template that was used in the past, and include that type of information. Feel free to reach out to me directly with any questions. But I think there's like a 4,500 word limit for the evaluation plan. And last, the evaluation report. So there is no template for that. However, it should be submitted as a Microsoft Word document, and it must include a title page. So the slide we have shows what the title page should include. So your AmeriCorps grant number for the project that was evaluated, name of your project, the date the report was completed, who your evaluator was, what organization they were associated with, if any, and what type of evaluation, internal or external. Happy to answer any questions, but I'll go ahead and pass it to Diane.
Great, thanks, Lou. I will pause for a moment to see if anyone wants to come off mute and ask any questions. Also, just a reminder, that same email address, if you have any questions about performance measures or your evaluation, we know that can get quite complicated. So please do send those questions to that Serve Washington email address, and we'll definitely route them to Lou.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so moving on to additional documents. Again, another reminder to please send those to our Serve Washington email address. Please always try to include as much in the subject or in the body of the email about what your application number is. There's also directions in the AmeriCorps application instructions about how to label those files, and we try to keep that all in uniform as we submit everything to AmeriCorps. So you'll definitely need that operation financial management survey to be done online. That's not something that you would need to necessarily submit to us, but we understand the link that AmeriCorps provided was no longer working, and we were able to find an alternate link. So we have updated our RFGA that's posted on our Serve Washington website with that correct link. So that should be working now. But if you have any questions, definitely let us know. And then here's a list of the other documents that you will also need to submit with your application. And then a few eGrants tips. These always seem to stand because eGrants has been around for a very long time. So we always suggest to create your application outside of eGrants in Microsoft Word. For example, do not do any updated or fancy formatting. eGrants, I will say it, is a very antiquated system, and it doesn't do well with any type of formatting that is not very basic. eGrants automatically double spaces when printing. We always recommend you print out your application before submitting, and review the page numbers yourself, because you will notice in the NOFO instructions it says page numbers will be based on how many pages are printed out from your application. Often save as you're working through screens. Save, save, save. You can never save enough. We recommend using Chrome. However, I've heard different feedback. So start with Chrome. If you find a different browser works better, that's fine. I would say the most important thing is printing out your application to double check page numbers and making sure that you save as you navigate around your application. A few other application tips: always remember to pay very close attention to those application instructions in the NOFO. Do not use web addresses or link anything to your application. Again, with the antiquated system, it doesn't do well with those. Make sure that, especially for recompetes, a lot of your information is automatically populated into your new recompete application. So make sure that you're going in and updating all sections. And even as you're building out a budget, for those of you that are new applicants, make sure that all your information, especially the numbers that you're using and the data, make sure that all matches up throughout your application. Some reminders about the project date, the accuracy as to who your authorized rep is, because they are the ones that will be getting those notifications and the communication about your application. And we know that we gave you a tight deadline of February 25th. I know we're all doing our best, but I highly recommend giving yourself an earlier deadline than 5 o'clock on the 25th, because we do not want you to be one of those people that tries to submit and eGrants is down or there's system issues. So I highly recommend getting it in as early as possible. However, if you do run into issues with submitting your application in eGrants, you'll definitely want to call the help desk and make sure you do not get off the phone with them until they've given you an incident number, because that incident number will be incredibly imperative for you to refer back to if your application is not submitted on time. We also recommend, the more sets of eyes on your application, the better. So if you have someone else in your organization or agency who's able to read through and double check or even triple check your application and they are impartial, even someone outside of your workspace, we highly recommend. Some reminders for recompetes. Remember, there's new criteria for your narratives. Please do not simply copy and paste from old narratives. You want to update as much information as possible. Pay special attention to the national performance measures, and always verify that what you currently have for your evaluation plan is up to date and meets all requirements. And again, you can check it anytime. Send us an email. We will route it to the correct person. I check that inbox multiple times a day. And with that, I believe there was at least one question in the chat that I wasn't answered that I will get to, but we are working on updating our readiness assessment on our website. So that should be updated very soon, if not already, but you should still be able to take it at any time. There's just some outdated contact information, but you should still be able to take that assessment if you're new and contemplating AmeriCorps, applying for an AmeriCorps grant. And like I said, we'll always have the RFGA posted on our website as we update links. Those get updated right away on the website. And there's that email address once again. Want to make sure that all questions go to that. And let me go to the Q&A. So Allison, if you don't mind taking yourself off mute, I wasn't quite sure what your question was, and I don't think that anyone else was able to answer it, so I'm hoping we can help you. Is Allison still on the call? That's okay. I can follow up with Allison via email. Now I would ask if any of you have any other questions or comments or clarifications needed. We have 1 minute left to try to help. If not, please send us an email. All right. Well, I don't see any hands up. Oh, sorry.
I have a quick question. Sorry, I forgot to put up my hand. This is Elizabeth
That's
from
okay.
EarthCorps.
No problem.
I am wondering, we have a couple other federal grants that we work with in our organization, and one of the things that we're hearing for those grants is that there is at some point in there somewhere, there is a certification of compliance with executive orders that is required, and it seems like it is maybe a little bit different depending on the grant. Sometimes you're certifying that compliance when you sign the grant. Sometimes there's a special like certification that you need to get. I'm wondering if you all have heard anything about that around this grant, and then also if you foresee any changes to monitoring down the line for that compliance.
I don't foresee any changes to monitoring at this time. That is not something that we have added to the monitoring policies and procedures here at the commission. So if that were to change, we would absolutely let everyone know, but we have not made any changes to our monitoring as of now. And then in terms of the assurances, I would pay special attention to what's on your application when you're submitting that. We know that additional language was added last spring to those assurances and certifications. So we were working closely with the AG to make sure moving forward that that wasn't going to be an issue, because they had enacted that language on grants that had already been awarded. So that's the main reason we were working with the AG on that. However, we would expect to see it most likely in your assurances and certifications for future funding. So I would pay close attention to that language and decide if that's something that your organization is willing to essentially sign off on. And we will keep a close eye as well, because we typically have those same assurances and certifications that you all do. So we will pay close attention to that and work with our legal counsel as we're submitting everything to AmeriCorps.
Thank you, Diane. That's
You're
really helpful.
welcome. Yeah. And I have not heard anything that there's anything separate, like there's a separate certification that you have to do in relation to the EO. So I would just pay close attention to what's embedded in that language. All right. Well, thank you all for your time today. We really appreciate it. We hope everyone has a successful award, and we're wanting to ensure that we help you out in every way that we can. So feel free to reach out to us via email, and we will respond as quickly as possible. Thank you.